Hi, I'm Rose Levy Beranbaum, and we're making today prosciutto bread and Grand Marnier cake, one of my most often requested cakes. You may wonder what these two baked goods have in common. Nothing, actually, but they demonstrate dramatically the difference between different types of flours. So join us today for more baking magic. Artisan breads are all the rage these days, but you know, they've been around for a lot longer than you think. This wonderful bread from Zito's Bakery, a prosciutto or lard bread, and you can see the marvelous coarse texture, is a rustic bread that comes from Bleecker Street in New York City. Mr. Zito opened up his bakery over 60 years ago, and I know that because that was just around the time that my father, Bob Levy, started making bagel peels for the entire New York area. And that is a secret as to why they gave me the recipe. It's never been given out before. You can see the wonderful coarse texture, and therefore it's better to break it up rather than to cut it with a knife, because if you cut it with a knife, you just get slick slices. Here you get all the nooks and crannies and texture of the bread. What makes this bread so chewy and rustic is bread flour. And I'm going to start to show you to make the bread by measuring or weighing the bread flour. This recipe uses 12 ounces of bread flour. So turn on the scale and balance it out, and then add the flour. And of course, if you're doing it by volume, you'll probably have to adjust after the recipe is done. Now, this is the fastest of all bread recipes that I know. I do it in the food processor, and I only give it one shaped rise, and it's ready to bake. 11.95, so I'm going to add just enough to bring it to 12. It's now exactly 12 ounces. And I'm ready to mix the dough. I'm using the metal blades because I'm not making that large a bread instead of the plastic dough blades. I'm using malt powder, or I could use sugar, but malt has a distinctive flavor that's really delicious. Salt and coarsely cracked black pepper. That brings out the flavor of the prosciutto. And the yeast doesn't go in until the salt is well mixed, because the one enemy that yeast has is salt. If it comes in direct contact with the yeast, it could kill it. It only takes a second to mix to protect the yeast from the salt. And now I'm adding the instant yeast that does not need to be proofed, because it's instant, and it can just be mixed in with the flour, so you never have to worry that you're killing it. But the secret to mixing in a food processor is to have the water very cold. Not ice cold, but cold, because the heat that's built up by those blades is going to bring up the dough by at least 10 degrees. So with the motor on, I'm going to add the water. And as soon as it comes together, process 45 seconds. Now let's check the dough. It should be sticky, but it shouldn't stick to your fingers. And you know why this is probably a little sticky, even though I weighed the flour? I didn't weigh the water. Every measuring cup measures a little different. So I'm going to add a little now, process it maybe for 3 seconds, and then if necessary, I'll do more when I'm finishing it by hand, because I'm going to add the prosciutto by hand, and that way I'll feel the consistency of the dough. Okay, now it just barely sticks, but it will still need a little more flour. I like to use this, what I call the magic flour wand, because it dusts it so lightly and evenly. So scrape the dough onto the flour. I'm going to just roughly pat it out as soon as I determine that the texture is right. Better to have too soft a dough than too stiff. It gets a much better texture and crisper crust. And you can see it's nice and soft and stretchy. I don't want to develop it too much because it'll be harder to add the prosciutto. And if you can get prosciutto cut for you, have it cut a little thicker than the way it usually comes when you eat it with melon. And I like to chop it up into 1/2 to 1/4 inch size pieces. And this is the fun part when you get to handle the dough. But you can see it only took 45 seconds to make this dough. It's sticking very, very slightly, but I'm just using the flour on the counter. That's all that I'm going to need to keep it the right consistency. It takes a couple of minutes to incorporate the prosciutto. So now that the prosciutto is evenly distributed through the dough and the dough is nice and smooth, as you can see, silky, a pleasure to touch, I don't have to let it rise, but I do have to let it rest, just so that I can roll it out, because I have to roll it to make a ring into 18 inches, and it will be too stretchy when it's first been made. So I put it into a greased bowl, cover it with plastic wrap. I could just leave it on the counter and cover it with plastic wrap. But I do have some made ahead that's been resting that I can use. And sprinkle the counter again. And now this is going to be rolled out into a long rope and then just overlapped. You can see it's already beginning to rise. When it rests, the yeast starts activating. And without kneading it, I'm just going to roll it into a rope. If at any point it feels like it's not getting any wider, what you can do is just cover it with plastic wrap again, let it rest another 5 minutes. If you use all-purpose flour, it won't be as chewy in the final bread, but it'll be a lot easier to roll out. See, you see, I'm starting from the middle and I'm rolling to the ends. And another trick to help it stretch more is to hold it up and pull it down, so you can really see by doing this how stretchy the dough is.